Good evening. My name is N.Sivalingam, and on behalf of my entire family, my mother, my sister Savajini, my brother-in-law Ramesh, my partner Gary, and our 2 children, my nephew Gana, my niece Priya, our uncles, aunts, and cousins, some of whom are here today, I wanted to thank everyone for attending the 2016 N.Sivalingam Memorial Lecture in Tamil Studies delivered by the eminent international jurist Navi Pillay. I know you are all eager to hear from her, so I will keep my remarks brief. I wanted to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of New Credit, and I would like to thank Chief Stacey Laforme for being here today. It was truly an honor to have you present here and to give us a blessing, the opening blessings. Tonight, I would like to give you a glimpse of the life of the man whose memory we honor today, N.Sivalingam, and the reason that our family established a graduate award in Tamil Studies at York University in our Appa's memory. Like so many immigrant stories, our Appa left his homeland in the early 1960s in search of better opportunities where he would be able to achieve his goals and dreams regardless of his ethnicity, the language he spoke, or his religious beliefs, something that he wasn't able to freely do in his own homeland because he was a Tamil. He eventually came to Canada in 1966 and decided to settle here and start a family. This, of course, was not easy, and I do not want to romanticize his story of immigration, and I also want to acknowledge our part as settlers in the continued colonization of First Nations people. Our father faced obstacles, hardships, racism, and discrimination in Canada, just as many groups currently experience today. However, in Canada, he had hopes and prospects for improvement and betterment, something that wasn't at the time and still isn't in the present day widely available to Tamils back home. While he chose to leave his homeland and settle in Canada, he recognized that many others were not as fortunate and had always remained tied to his homeland and the Tamil struggle for peace and justice. Appa took great pride in his Tamil identity and made sure that his children and grandchildren could grow up in a place where they could also be rooted in their cultural identity. Sacrificing time with his family over the next 50 years of his life, he dedicated himself to building and maintaining social, cultural, and religious institutions in Canada so that current and future generations of Tamils would be secure in their Tamil identity. Like many diaspora Tamils, the conflict in his homeland left a deep scar on his psyche, and our Appa was committed and dedicated to ensuring who were left behind were not forgotten. And by working with like-minded members of the community, many of whom are here today in this room, to raise funds for various developmental projects that serve displaced persons and advocating at various levels of government for humanitarian assistance for refugees and displaced people in the North and East, and eventually, hopefully, for a political solution. In particular, the final phase of the armed conflict deeply and profoundly affected my father. In 2009, in the last year of his life, like many members of the Tamil diaspora around the world, our father was glued to the internet websites and Tamil television networks and radios that covered the horrific news of mass atrocities, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide that were taking place in his homeland. My Appa, like many of us in the Tamil diaspora, felt helpless, voiceless, and powerless. On most days, he would take part in the demonstrations that took place in Toronto and Ottawa, often taking his grandson, Gana, who was 10 years old at the time, with him. This leads me to where we are today. The first encounter that I had with Ms. Pillay, the first time Gary and I met Navi Pillay was in 2009 in Geneva when she was the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Months earlier, with my newborn daughter sitting in our lap, bombarded with the horrific images from back home that were ingrained in my memory, I had written a letter to Navi Pillay requesting a meeting. I had forgotten about the letter until I received an email sometime in January from Navi Pillay's assistant informing us that she had agreed to meet with me and a group of diaspora Tamils concerned about the deteriorating human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Gary and I, along with our daughter Bhairavi, who was 5 months old at the time, packed our bags and flew to Geneva. That meeting changed the course of both of our lives and set both of us on the paths that we have taken today. There are 2 things that I will always stand out in my mind from that first encounter with Navi Pillay. The first is her genuine commitment towards human rights and justice, which is not only evident in her incredible record of domestic and international human rights protection, but also in her very being. This was not my first time in Geneva. I'd previously lived there on a human rights internship, monitoring various human rights bodies. Watching and observing these processes made me very cynical about the international human rights system, its bureaucratic and politicized nature. However, Navi Pillay's personal commitment to upholding principles of justice and human rights shattered these negative perceptions of the international human rights system. Within that bureaucratic and politicized process, there was a genuine human rights champion at the helm with a proven track record of achieving justice, and that gave me hope. The second thing that stood out in my mind was that after she listened to our concerns and towards the end of the meeting, Navi Pillay said something that had been ingrained in my subconscious ever since. She told us, and I paraphrase, that the Tamil diaspora has failed to intellectualize our struggle for human rights. What does this mean? Well, my takeaway from that statement was that unlike other human rights struggles that engage with academia to theorize, research, and disseminate their human rights struggles to a broader audience, the Tamil diaspora has neglected to fully engage with this important and key element of the advocacy process. This is not to say that there isn't brilliant Tamil scholarship, academic research, writing, and activism that is already in existence both back home and in the diaspora. However, there is to some extent a theoretical and practical gap in disseminating this scholarship and research to a wider audience, and encouraging, motivating, and mentoring young, emergent, and aspiring scholars to pursue academic work in Tamil studies. This simple statement has stayed with me ever since, and in part led me towards the path to pursue graduate studies and brings us to where we are here today. Our family takes what Navi Pillay said to heart. Like her, we also feel that there is a strong need to intellectualize and institutionalize the promotion and protection of human rights for Tamils, the political aspirations of Tamil people, and Tamil studies in the diaspora.
Let me say that it's a great privilege for me to join this distinguished audience, and I'm truly impressed with the events that we just witnessed, including the welcome we received from the leader of the First Nation. I'm also very familiar with First Nations here, and I told the chief that when I came to Montreal, when I was a judge, then I went to the Mohawk community. Well, it's hard to change things. The men could enter through the front door and the women had to go around the back. So we maintain our traditions, but we also keep pace with international human rights standards. Harini, thank you for your very warm welcome. I don't know where you are. Yeah, I didn't realize that so soon after I had become High Commissioner that I saw you and Gary. I became High Commissioner for Human Rights in September 2008, and during that month, it's always the high-level summit in New York where all the heads of state attend. So that was my first. And I received a specific request that the President of Sri Lanka wished to see me. So it was President Rajapaksa. And he told me that he is about to embark on a huge campaign to end terrorism in his country, and that I should not criticize him. So when someone tells you not to do something, then you pay particular attention to that issue. I want to congratulate the foundation and the N.Sivalingam family, firstly, for holding this lecture. It's very important. It encourages all of us to engage in dialogue rather than violence. And secondly, I think that the establishment of this award in Tamil studies is important, and that it should be used to provide direction, to look for strategies on how to address conflicts. So congratulations to the awardee, and I hope these kind of studies will be very helpful to the community as a whole. And when I speak of strategies and an intellectual direction, I'm thinking of some good examples. You know, when President Mandela came out and he devised a national anthem with all 3 languages, including the hated Afrikaans language, we were all very shocked. But you can see the leadership there because it built all of us together into a nation. We stopped hating a language. You can't hate a language. You hate the apartheid practice. And of course, you know Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when he was Archbishop outside here, called upon stevedores in various ports not to offload South African coal. And when it hit the pockets of big business, you will start to see change, which we did.
But my question is how Sri Lanka is contextualized and compared to other situations in which we talk about transitional justice and accountability. Unlike other countries, Sri Lanka is a bit unique because the transition we speak of is really sort of changing the head of the body but not changing the body itself. And I guess my question is, how does that factor into any kind of accountability mechanism we decide to use going forward, given that there isn't really too much of a transition in the way we've seen in Rwanda or Yugoslavia?
Let me first congratulate you and thank you for your brothers and sisters, the hospitality I enjoyed in 2009 when I was in South Africa when I launched a hunger strike. Now coming to the problem dealing with this, I'm just making a comparative study. We do not anyway belittle or decry the struggle of South African people, the colored people against the white domination. But comparing the South African struggle with ours, South Africa was racial discrimination, racial segregation, but there was no racial liquidation as such. Therefore, the problem was only skin deep. In the context of Sri Lanka, there is not racial discrimination. In addition to that, there is racial liquidation. Out to finish, it's called genocide. Therefore, the problem in Sri Lanka is so deep. When we compare it, I am not here to belittle or decry any of the leaders. Nelson Mandela's 27 years of solitary confinement is not to be just ridiculed. We are fully with him. The second question is, you spoke of the question of land. To us, the crux of the Tamil problem is land. We may lose everything and regain. Land is necessary not only for the self-expression of an ethnic group, it's necessary for its physical survival. Now there's inroads made into our territory, make us a microscopic minority or a non-entity in our own homeland. Where do we survive? The third question is, we have suffered enough for the last 67 years. What is the panacea for all the political ills we are facing? Unitary constitution cannot succeed. Federal constitution, we are for it, but it cannot be a one-sided love affair. The single is not prepared to live with us. Therefore, we are left with the only alternative is right of self-determination. Call it by any name. Therefore, 3 questions I have asked. Please give us a reply and tell us what is the panacea for all the political ills we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got a letter from the then foreign minister of Sri Lanka. They were furious with me. Why did you have to appoint such high-level people as advisors? So I want you to see what this is about. Every step is a struggle. You have to have a strategy. If that wasn't done by people outside, like Gary and Harina, for instance, and my staff, we wouldn't have got where we were. So it was essential that the diaspora work with governments outside. So you got at least one resolution adopted. Now you gave the criteria for transitional justice. Yes, I support all of that because you have to keep the bar up there. You don't begin with the compromise. Anyway, I just want to finish that High Commissioner Zayed was advised by the 3 experts to give the extension of time to the new government, hoping that they will cooperate. So he followed advice there. This is what we also struggle with, all the issues on transitional justice. So we demand what people deserve, what's in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration. It's not always practical that you achieve that. But human rights defenders know to place the bar up there. Many times in the high-level bodies chaired by the Secretary General, that's exactly what I would do. I would say these should be all the demands for Afghanistan, for instance. And they said, why do you have to ask for everything? Let's just talk about peace now. And I said, I'm asking for everything that you put in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I wish you well with that transitional justice scenario. We didn't achieve that in South Africa at various levels. President Mandela had to compromise because we were working with the apartheid government still. And that's why we didn't have prosecutions or a tribunal. However, I agree with the last speaker. You cannot compare the situations in different countries. Some aspects may be the same. So you can't plant a transitional justice model that worked in one country into another. South Africa followed the model in Peru, for instance. We did have an amnesty court. The president of that amnesty court was a judge, Hassan Mala, who himself had been banned, house arrested. And he told me how he hated granting amnesty to the perpetrators of apartheid violence. So that's what I mean. The TRC in South Africa was a politically expedient solution. It worked because the people accepted it as something that they must accept in order to move forward. They were interested in building a nation and building a country. I know that Archbishop Desmond Tutu, immediately after the Rwandan genocide, was speaking in Rwanda when he told them, you should have a TRC like we had in South Africa. And that whole audience told Desmond Tutu, you had dealt with racism there. We are dealing with genocide here, and we want criminal justice. So, crucially then, it has to be something, a model that people are willing to accept. But human rights defenders, as I say, should ask for what victims and survivors want. They want justice and accountability. Now, clearly, I am in no position to answer your three questions on the fact that Sri Lankan conflict is deep. But let me say to you, sitting outside here in Canada, that those people in Sri Lanka are looking to you to help them strategize and come up with ideas. So you have to ensure that their voices are heard outside here. I looked at this land question in there as well, and truly appreciate, and that's why I made my remarks about military structures being built over Tamil lands, being built over cemeteries, and so on. So otherwise, it's very, very difficult for an outsider to dictate a solution to the country. And of course, the second question, it's very difficult when you don't have a cooperative government who don't have the political will to address justice and accountability, maybe because they're afraid that it'll come too close to them. So they have reasons to avoid the justice process. I would say we have to keep demanding what is just. One of the witnesses many of the witnesses in the Rwanda tribunal said to us judges, we waited for this day to see justice being done. And that's the point of view. I went to Guatemala where they were a forensic team was very slowly examining bones and so on to identify the victims. And all the victims' families were there, still weeping, still waiting for the disappeared to be identified. I think 4 or 6 were successfully identified because of that very careful examination of bones. And that is many, many years after the military had committed atrocities in Guatemala. And the Cambodian court, let me say, only happened 20 years after the event. I'm not saying that Sri Lankans should be patient and wait that long, but at least be practical when you help the people in Sri Lanka to devise solutions.
Hi, my name is Gurnab Dewi. I am a PhD student here at Osgood, and before that, I'm a Syrian human rights lawyer as well, who fought for freedom in Syria, and I had to leave like a year and a half after the war, because what I want to say, or what I want to describe as the lack of humanitarian protection in Syria, and I really so my question to you, so it's the lack of the humanitarian protection for Syrian citizens. So you were addressing, or you were telling us about your letter to the to refer the Syrian atrocities to the ICC, along with 60 countries. So, but this is again depends on the Security Council's approval. So it's again like any other. Political action has to have like political will. So my question to you, whether you are aware of any other legal or solution that Syrian human rights lawyers can approach to hold perpetrators of the Syrian crisis accountable. Thank you.
Thank you for your really clear assessment, Dr. Pillay. Just a really quick question on the question of strategy. You said, and I think Harini paraphrased you as saying, intellectualizing the struggle. One of the things the Tamil communities, the Elam Tamil community did historically during 2009 was a lot of direct action. I remember there was one action trying to email you, and I think we downed your email server at one point. Like actions like that. Now, how should that be incorporated within the strategy with the intellectualizing and the research and the information and the dissemination? Was that counterproductive? Because there's a lot of protests at the UN headquarters, at New York, in front of embassies, et cetera, where like there's mass mobilization. Are you critical of those mobilizations? Were they counterproductive, or did they play a possible role in maybe pressuring the UN to be more responsive and maybe getting some reforms within the UN bureaucracy?
Thank you, Ms. Pillay. So I guess two questions. One, and this is not about Sri Lanka. From your view, was the state of human rights better in the world when you left than before it started? So did human rights become better or worse during your tenure? And what were some of the shortcomings of your offices that led to that? If it decreased, what are some of the shortcomings, and how can they be reformed? I guess that's the question.
Thank you. And last question, then. Thank you very much for keeping these brief.
Thank you, Ms. Pillay. I wanted to ask about what you would say to people who have lost faith in the international processes that have occurred. What has happened since the change in government in Sri Lanka, the international community now being a lot more positive in their engagement, restarting military engagement and other things. What would you say to the significant portion of the community who are now disillusioned with international processes in gaining accountability?
I agree. These are all very important questions. They will continue to occupy my mind, because I also learn from dialogue such as this on what we should be thinking about. Let me say a little bit of my background. There are published remarks where I was totally against any kind of compromise when we were devising our constitution. So in other words, I was very critical of President Mandela. But now I see that some of the moves he was forced to make actually benefited us to get from there to here. We haven't ended our struggle. There are many lawyers still claiming compensation for victims, and there are young people who actually, well, there was a lone voice, I think, saying Mandela was a traitor because he sold out on the rights of ordinary people to land and jobs and so on. So it's an ongoing process. I too have learned that from the beginning we cannot say all or nothing. We accept what we get and we use those as tools to get to where we want to go. But please don't even think that I'm an expert on all this. I'm not. Now, the Syrian human rights lawyer, let me empathize with your struggles. Yeah, where are you? I have gone public before the Security Council and said the Syrian situation is the worst failure on the part of the United Nations. We have this wonderful framework, and there cannot be greater violations of human rights, humanitarian law, human rights law. 200,000 killed, that's the figure I left with, that's by name and the place where they died, and millions, 4 million children alone displaced. How can we even say we have a United Nations when we turn a blind eye to this? And so I continue to call for justice and accountability for all Syrians. And I've heard from women who came out of Syria. They recently had an opportunity to be at the UN, and I go from here to the United Nations to address a panel on justice and accountability, because there's a real danger that those two important demands will not be addressed by the Geneva peace talks. If they continue to make peace with individuals whom we consider are serious perpetrators of international crimes, then what kind of peace is that? So that's what I will be doing. I encourage you to do the same. That's what I would agree with your language. These are the legal resources and the tools at our disposal to hold perpetrators to account. There is an initiative led by the French government, which many states are supporting now, which is to convince the P5 not to use the veto in situations where there have been grave human rights violations or atrocity crimes. So if there's sufficient support for that by all governments, and if the General Assembly supports it, but that would be a good measure to get the P5, I mean, I think it's impossible to get them to give up this veto, but at least not to use it. It's, to me, completely unacceptable that they use a veto when we are telling them. I was there soon after 1,000 peaceful protesters were shot by the Assad government just for demanding their civil and political, economic, social rights. So instead of talking with the peaceful protesters, they shot them. And that's when I first addressed the Security Council. So what I'm saying here, forthright criticism is very, very important. So even though we disillusion with the state of the world, of course we realize in South Africa, for instance, that the wealth of the country belongs to the West. The gold mines and so on were owned by Anglo-American. So we saw the big picture. You still prodded at ending racial discrimination. It was a step to getting to a proper sharing of all rights in our country.
Briefly address the President's questions, because I think your time.
Is it time? You want me done? It's time for what? Became Jim. Let me tell you, all your research and your emails are very, very important. The Secretary General reads them. He meets with NGOs. So when you're sitting in a position of power where you can do something, you can well forget about some issue because there's crisis piling onto our desks all the time. So your emails and your statistics and research are very, very important. And they're very important for victims in the country because they can't shout as loud as you, but they can put out the statistics or notes that you've come up with. It is difficult when we're dealing with dictators. There are many in Africa, for instance. There are the largest number of journalists in prison in Ethiopia just for criticizing the government. So there are some terrible places in the world. I think, to me, that's a bigger reason why we should care and help them as far as we can. Are human rights better or worse in the world? I would have said they are better, except there is the Syria situation, which is ongoing, and it's as I said, it's a failure on our part. It's caused the flow of refugees. What I do say is we have better mechanisms to address it now than we had before. We never had an international criminal court to render justice where states fail to render justice. We have it now. And we have social media, so we can spread our messages to all people. Young people and people everywhere are speaking in terms of rights now. They're speaking of right to food, right to water, right to health. These were unheard of before. When I started, I was told not to touch economic and social rights because these are aspirations and not rights. So we've made some progress in empowering people. I think that addresses all the questions so far. All right, and that's what I have time for. Thank you very much for your questions.